January 1933. Adolf Hitler took control of Germany. Beside him stood the men who built the machinery of the Reich. But behind those men were their wives. These women did not just watch from the sidelines. They occupied the center of power. They were symbols. They were the faces of the Nazi ideal. They hosted galas, managed estates, and reinforced the party's ideology within the German home. Why did they remain loyal until the end? It was not just duty, it was a shared belief in absolute supremacy. For years, they enjoyed stolen wealth and social status. But 1945 changed everything. The privilege vanished. The luxury became a target. For these women, loyalty carried a lethal price tag. Magda Goebbels was the most prominent among them. She was the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. She was not a silent partner. To the public, she was the First Lady of the Third Reich. She was graceful. She was disciplined. She appeared at every major rally, standing directly behind Hitler. In private, the connection was even deeper. She considered Hitler a father figure to her children. The footage shows the reality of April 1945. Berlin was a graveyard of broken concrete and fire. The Soviet Red Army was blocks away. Most high-ranking officials were burning documents and fleeing toward the mountains. The Goebbels family did the opposite. Magda and Joseph gathered their 6 children. The eldest was 12. The youngest was only 4. They descended into the Führerbunker. The smell of damp concrete and diesel fuel filled the tunnels. Constant explosions rocked the ceiling. Magda stayed. She believed a world without National Socialism was not worth living in. There was no escape plan. There were no forged passports. April 30th, 1945. The end arrived. Inside his private room, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. The news spread through the bunker corridors in minutes. The guards froze. The staff began to drink. The leadership was gone. May 1st, 1945. Magda Goebbels prepared for her final act. She did not cry. She did not hesitate. Witnesses saw her moving with mechanical precision. She walked toward the room where her children slept. But this was only the beginning of the horror. She carried out a task that remains one of the most chilling events in the history of the war. She did not see a future for her children in a defeated Germany. She saw only a choice between death and dishonor. She chose death. The regime had reached its final stop. May 1st, 1945. Deep inside the Führerbunker, Magda Goebbels prepared for the end. She did not act alone. Her husband Joseph assisted as she poisoned their 6 children. One by one, the siblings died in their sleep. Medical reports suggest a 2-step process. First, morphine or sedatives to dull their senses. Then, crushed cyanide capsules. Some witnesses claim Magda spoke softly to them, saying they were simply going to sleep. The result remained unchanged. All 6 children were dead at the hands of their parents. But this was only the beginning. The Goebbels couple climbed the stairs to the Reich Chancellery Garden. Rain and smoke filled the air. They did not intend to be captured. Evidence indicates they swallowed cyanide pills. To ensure the result, Joseph or an adjutant likely fired a shot into their heads. Soldiers poured gasoline over the bodies. Flames rose. Their remains burned in a shallow pit, mimicking the disposal of Adolf Hitler the previous day. Magda left a paper trail. She wrote several letters before the final act. Her words were clear. She refused to let her children grow up in a world without National Socialism. To Magda, a Germany without the party was a graveyard. She believed their lives had no value after the regime fell. The reaction was immediate. The footage from the bunker shows a grim scene. Even battle-hardened SS officers expressed shock. Men who had seen mass executions were disturbed. They could not understand a mother choosing to kill her offspring rather than let them live in defeat. The crime was a signal of total collapse. At first glance, Magda was the ultimate Nazi mother, but in reality, she was not the only woman tied to the crumbling leadership. Events accelerated elsewhere. A few days earlier, another woman tried to outrun the advancing Allied lines. Margaret Himmler was the wife of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Her devotion to the ideology was just as absolute. She came from a wealthy conservative background. She was proud of her status and the future the party promised. The camera records a different image of Margaret. She was a trained nurse. During the conflict, she volunteered for the German Red Cross. Her personal letters survive. In them, she praised Hitler and admired the Nazi elite. She expressed total support for her husband's career. She claimed to be unaware of the full scope of the Holocaust. There was no mistake about her loyalty. The couple had one daughter, Gudrun, born in 1929. Margaret raised her with strict discipline. The household ran on loyalty and German values. Margaret was a public figure. She visited wounded soldiers in hospitals. She attended official SS ceremonies. She maintained deep connections within the Nazi hierarchy until the very end. But this status was a trap. She was not part of the inner political circle. As the Soviet tanks closed in, her influence vanished. Her husband was on the run. The world she helped build was turning into a pile of rubble. The story cut off here. May 1945. Millions of people faced starvation and ruins across Europe. The Nazi regime had collapsed. Heinrich Himmler realized his time was up. He did not face the end with courage. He shaved his mustache, put a patch over his left eye, and donned the uniform of a low-ranking soldier in the secret field police. He carried forged papers under the name Heinrich Hitzinger. He hoped to blend into the thousands of refugees moving through the German countryside. British soldiers stopped him at a checkpoint near Bremen. They noticed his papers were too perfect. His behavior was too nervous. They took him into custody for questioning. On May 23, 1945, he finally revealed his true identity. During a medical examination, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. The poison acted instantly. He collapsed on the floor. British doctors tried to pump his stomach, but it was too late. He was dead within 15 minutes. He escaped the hangman's noose. But what about his wife? Margaret Himmler was hiding in northern Italy with her daughter, Gudrun. American troops found them on May 13, 1945. They didn't see her as an innocent bystander. They arrested her immediately. The Allies viewed her as a symbol of the regime. They believed she promoted Nazi values and supported one of the most brutal men in history. She spent the next 3 years behind barbed wire. Guards moved her between different Allied internment camps. One of them was in Augsburg. She sat in cold cells, away from the life of luxury she once knew. In 1948, a denazification court in Germany opened her file. The judges looked for the truth. Margaret had a defense ready. She claimed she was just a nurse and a mother. She told the court she never understood her husband's work. She said she never touched politics. But the investigators had evidence. They read her wartime diaries and private letters. The documents told a different story. They showed a woman who shared her husband's hatreds. She wasn't a victim of circumstances. She was a believer. The court delivered its verdict. Thus ended the myth of her innocence. 1948. The court delivered its verdict. Margaret Himmler was classified as a lesser offender under the post-war denazification laws. The judges sentenced her to 4 years in a labor camp. They deducted the time she had already spent in detention. It was a light sentence given her husband's role in the Holocaust. But for Margaret, the world she built had already turned to ash. She walked out of prison and vanished. She discarded her name and moved to Munich. She lived in a small apartment, avoided neighbors, and stayed away from cameras. She lived in total isolation until her death in 1967. Her daughter, Gudrun, took a different path. Gudrun organized aid for former SS members and defended her father's legacy until her final breath. Margaret chose silence. She never spoke to a reporter again. For some women of the Reich, the war did not end with a sentence. It ended with a void. This was the fate of Gerda Bormann. Her husband was Martin Bormann. He was not just a bureaucrat. He was the private secretary to Adolf Hitler. He was the shadow behind the throne. Bormann held the keys to the chancellery. He decided who saw the Führer and who did not. He signed the orders for mass deportations. He managed the party's finances. He was the most powerful man in Germany after Hitler himself. While other leaders sought the spotlight, Bormann stayed in the dark. His power was silent and absolute. May 1945. The Third Reich crumbled. Russian shells hit the chancellery walls. Amid the smoke and fire, Martin Bormann disappeared. The paper trail stopped. The radio went silent. The last confirmed sighting occurred on May 2nd. Witnesses saw him near the Lehrter station in Berlin. He was trying to break through the Soviet encirclement. Then, he was gone. Gerda was left with 5 children and 0 answers. She fled to South Tyrol. She waited for a sign or a letter that never arrived. How does a man like Bormann simply evaporate? At first glance, it seemed like a successful escape to South America, but in reality, there was no trace. For Gerda, the war did not end with a funeral. It ended with a question mark. She died of cancer in 1946 without knowing the truth. The search for her husband would continue for decades. May 2nd, 1945. Martin Bormann fled the center of Berlin with a group of high-ranking officials. The trail went cold immediately. Some witnesses claimed Soviet shells hit the group directly. Others swore they saw him slip through the ruins toward the Western lines. By the time the Nuremberg trials opened in 1945, the lead prosecutor had an empty chair. The court tried him in absentia in 1946. The verdict was death by hanging. But there was no prisoner to execute. No body, no grave, only whispers. For Gerda Bormann, the silence was a cage. She lived in a state of permanent hesitation. One report placed her husband in a ditch near the Spree River. Another placed him on a boat to South America. People whispered that he was living under a false name in the mountains. Gerda refused to accept his death. She kept his belongings ready. She acted as if a knock on the door would come at any moment. But reality was different. She was alone with 10 children and a name that had become a global brand for a criminal regime. The Bormann name was not just a signature, it was a physical weight. The children reacted to the pressure in different ways. Some changed their names and disappeared into the crowd. Others remained fiercely loyal to the family myth. How did the son of a war criminal find peace? The answer was unexpected. Martin Bormann Jr. turned to the church. He became a Catholic priest. He spent decades traveling and lecturing, attempting to dismantle the legacy his father built. He chose a life of service to balance a history of destruction. At first glance, she was the wife of a powerful man. But in reality, she was a social pariah. While the world searched for her husband, Gerda's health failed. Doctors diagnosed her with terminal cancer in 1946. She moved to an army hospital in South Tyrol. The footage from that era shows a woman withered by disease. She died later that year at the age of 36. She died without closure. She never remarried. She never renounced her loyalty to the man who vanished. The mystery remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. 1972. Construction workers were digging near the Lehrter station in Berlin. The shovels hit bone. They uncovered 2 skeletons buried in the red soil, exactly where witnesses last saw Bormann. Forensic experts examined the teeth. In the 1990s, DNA technology provided the final answer. The bones belonged to Martin Bormann. He had died in May 1945. Glass fragments found in the jaw confirmed the cause. He had bitten a cyanide capsule to avoid Soviet capture. By the time the truth surfaced, Gerda had been dead for 26 years. She died in the dark. Her children were left to carry the remains of the story. Some women refused to let the past die. Ilse Hess was one of them. Her husband, Rudolf Hess, had been the deputy Führer. His story was even more bizarre. Thus ended one chapter, but another was just beginning. May 10th, 1941. Rudolf Hess climbed into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 110. He took off from Augsburg, flying north toward Scotland. He flew alone. He bypassed radar and navigated the North Sea in total silence. Why did the deputy Führer abandon his post? At first glance, it was a diplomatic mission. But in reality, it was a suicide mission for his reputation. Hess claimed he wanted to negotiate a peace treaty with the Duke of Hamilton. He wanted to end the war between Germany and Britain. Events accelerated. Hess parachuted into a field near Eaglesham. British soldiers did not welcome him with a handshake. They arrested him immediately. They moved him between secret locations and high-security cells. He became a prisoner of war. The reaction in Berlin was swift. Adolf Hitler did not praise the move. He went into a rage. He stripped Hess of all titles and ordered his name removed from official records. The Nazi leadership issued a public statement. They declared Hess was suffering from hallucinations and mental instability. He was now an embarrassment to the Third Reich. The footage shows Hess sitting in the dock at the Nuremberg trials in 1945. He stares blankly at the judges. He claims he has amnesia. The court was not convinced. In 1946, the verdict was read. Guilty of crimes against peace. Guilty of conspiracy. The sentence, life imprisonment. Soldiers transported him to Spandau prison in Berlin. He stayed there for 41 years. He was the only prisoner in a massive stone fortress. He remained behind those bars until his death in 1987. Ilse Hess faced a different fate. In 1945, Allied forces rounded up the wives of the Nazi elite. They arrested Ilse. They placed her in a detention camp for several years. The courts labeled her a lesser offender. She regained her freedom, but she lost her status. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her social circle vanished. There was no mistake. Ilse did not distance herself from the ideology. She did not apologize. Instead, she doubled down. She spent the next 5 decades campaigning to clear her husband's name. She wrote letters to international leaders. She gave interviews to any journalist who would listen. She published books titled England, Nuremberg, Spandau. She had a single narrative. She claimed Rudolf was a martyr. She argued the flight to Scotland was a heroic act of peace, not a betrayal. To her, the world was wrong, and the Nazi cause was misunderstood. She stayed loyal to a ghost. Rudolf Hess died in 1987. The official report, suicide by hanging with an electrical cord. Many suspected a cover-up. Ilse fueled the conspiracy theories until her own death in 1995. She never abandoned the party principles that had destroyed Europe. But not every Nazi wife chose loyalty to the regime. One woman took a different path entirely. Emily Schindler did not follow the script. 1,200 Jews. This was the number of lives saved by a Nazi party member and his factory. The world knows the name Oskar Schindler, but history often ignores the woman standing next to him. Emily Schindler worked in the shadows. She managed the daily survival of the workers. She bought food on the black market. She organized medical supplies. She hid fugitives from the SS during inspections. Every action carried a death sentence. 1949. The couple fled to Argentina to escape the collapse of Germany. They brought nothing but a few belongings. Prosperity did not follow them. Oskar failed in one business venture after another. He went bankrupt. In 1957, he boarded a ship back to Germany. He left Emily behind in South America. He never returned. The footage from this period is bleak. Emily lived in a small house on the edge of San Vicente. She raised chickens and goats to stay alive. She lacked money for basic necessities. For decades, the global spotlight stayed fixed on her husband. Emily remained in the dark. She was a German speaker in a Spanish-speaking land, isolated and forgotten. The silence broke in the 1990s. Biographers and journalists finally arrived at her door. Her role in the rescue operation was documented, but the recognition came late. She had already spent 30 years in poverty. In 2001, she traveled back to Germany. She died in a hospital near Berlin at the age of 93. She was buried far from the husband who had abandoned her. But Emily was a rarity. Other women in the inner circle watched the horrors and felt no guilt. Lena Heydrich was one of them. She was the wife of Reinhard Heydrich. He was the architect of the final solution. In 1942, Czech resistance fighters assassinated him in Prague. Lena did not distance herself from his actions. She spent the next 4 decades defending them. The historical record is clear. British and American authorities arrested her after the war. She faced denazification trials. She was released without a prison sentence. She moved to the island of Fehmarn in the Baltic Sea. She ran a hotel. She remarried a Finnish theater director, but her ideology remained unchanged. In the 1970s, she gave interviews to the press. The camera shows a woman without regret. She spoke with pride about the man the world called the Butcher of Prague. She published a memoir titled Life with a War Criminal. The book was not an apology. It was a defense. She claimed her husband was a misunderstood patriot. She felt no shame for the millions of deaths he orchestrated. While some wives clung to their pride, others retreated into a wall of silence. Margaret Speer took this path. She was married to Albert Speer. He was Hitler's chief architect and the Minister of Armaments. He directed the German war machine using slave labor. During the Nuremberg trials, he sat in the dock. Margaret stayed in the background. She did not testify. She did not protest. She simply waited for the verdict. October 1st, 1946. The court delivered the verdict. Albert Speer received 20 years for his role in the Nazi machine. Elizabeth Speer watched the collapse from a distance. She never appeared at the Nuremberg courthouse. She didn't sign petitions or grant interviews to the international press. No letters of support reached the newspapers. She remained in the shadows, far from the flashbulbs of the cameras. 20 years passed in silence. Elizabeth raised their children alone, while her husband sat in Spandau prison. In 1966, the heavy steel gates opened. Speer was free. They reunited, but the dynamic had shifted. Albert Speer became a global celebrity. He sold millions of books and appeared on television screens across the West. He was the good Nazi. Elizabeth stayed in the background. She refused the fame. She lived quietly until her death in 1980. In her husband's massive memoirs, her name is barely a footnote. But this was only the beginning of a darker pattern. How did the wives of the true fanatics survive? For Annie Brandt, there was no quiet retirement. Her husband was Rudolf Brandt. He was the personal administrative officer to Heinrich Himmler. Brandt handled the paperwork for the human medical experiments in the concentration camps. He documented the torture. In 1948, the hangman finished his work. Rudolf Brandt was executed. For Annie, the world vanished. At first glance, she was a widow, but in reality, she was an outcast. The government seized her house and every piece of property. The bank accounts were frozen. The sound of investigators knocking on her door became a routine. She was interrogated for months. Events accelerated toward total isolation. Unlike other Nazi wives, Annie didn't fight back. She didn't claim ignorance or write books defending her husband's memory. She chose total erasure. She changed her life, avoided her remaining relatives, and never spoke to a journalist. The name Brandt was a mark of shame. She never remarried. She lived in a small apartment, hidden from a world that remembered her husband's crimes. The weight of the evidence was too heavy. Annie Brandt simply ceased to exist in the public record. The story cut off here. Traudl Junge occupied a unique position in history. She was 22 years old during the height of the conflict. As Adolf Hitler's personal secretary, she worked inside the Berlin bunker during the final days of the Third Reich. Her hands typed Hitler's private and political will. She was one of the last people to see him alive before the suicide. After the war, the sequence of events moved fast. Soviet forces captured her first. Then came the American interrogators. They found no evidence of direct war crimes. No charges were filed. But the question remained, should she have seen the truth? In later interviews, the footage shows a woman haunted by silence. She didn't feel guilty for her actions. She felt guilty for her lack of curiosity. She lived the rest of her life realizing she had looked away until it was too late. Henriette von Schirach lived at the top of the social hierarchy. She was a personal friend of the Führer. Her husband, Baldur von Schirach, commanded the Hitler Youth and governed Vienna. They were Nazi royalty. That status vanished in 1945. The regime collapsed. Baldur received a 20-year prison sentence at Nuremberg. Henrietta was arrested and held for several months. Allied officers questioned her repeatedly. Upon her release, the court labeled her a fellow traveler. This meant she was not a primary criminal, but a supporter of the system. She divorced her husband. She tried to build a new life from the ruins. But the past remained. In her memoirs, she described how the spectacle of power blinded her. She felt misled by the propaganda. The damage was permanent. Some stories were erased by design. Ingeborg Weber-Donitz was the wife of Karl Donitz. In 1945, Hitler named Karl his successor. For a few days, he led a dying Germany. Later, the Nuremberg tribunal sentenced him to 10 years in prison. His crimes were naval, considered less severe than the Holocaust architects. Ingeborg responded by vanishing. She maintained an extremely low profile for decades. She gave no interviews. She wrote no books. She made no public comments on her husband's career. She lived quietly with her children in a small house until 1962. Public records of her life are almost non-existent. For her, silence was a survival strategy. Fading away was safer than standing out. Why did the children suffer? They didn't choose their parents. But the pain did not stop with the wives. A new generation grew up under a heavy shadow. They inherited names that triggered horror in the public. They were judged for crimes they did not commit. By the 1960s and 70s, most of the high-ranking wives had died or entered extreme old age. West Germany was changing. A new generation of students and activists emerged. They had questions. They demanded to know exactly what their parents did during the war. The atmosphere shifted. Protests filled the streets. New books were published. Old trials were reopened for fresh evidence. The stories of these women resurfaced. They were no longer seen as victims or mourning widows. They were viewed as hidden witnesses to a dark era. In 1993, the film Schindler's List brought Emily Schindler back into the global spotlight. In 2002, the documentary Blind Spot featured Trottle Young speaking directly to the camera about her regrets. More testimonies appeared. The silence finally cracked. The end of the war was more than a military surrender. It was a total collapse of identity for the wives of the elite. These women lived at the center of a violent global machine. When it stopped, they were trapped between public hatred and personal grief. Some committed suicide. Others lost every possession they owned. A few remained loyal to the ideology until death. None of them escaped the consequences. The story ended in the shadows.